Barakatah Yahweh, Barakatah Yahushai, Bahasham, Barakahak Barakatum. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, glory, and infinite honors to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahushai. Double honors to the apostles and elders, a great millstone who rule and teach well. In peace and salutations to you sincere Akim out there, pushing this word in truth and sincerity to the four corners of the globe. May you brothers endure until the end. This is the brother Ra'aya with another video, and in this video I'm going to start it off in the book of Obadiah, which is a chapter dedicated entirely to you Edomites, known as you so-called white people today, you Americans, British, Europeans, Russians, etc., etc. I'm going to start in verse 1 and jump around a bit, and as you can see, the header reads, Edom will be humbled. The vision of Obadiah. Thus saith the Lord Yahweh concerning Edom. We have heard a rumor from Yahweh, and an ambassador is sent among the heathen. And that ambassador sent among the heathen are the men of the Lord, the prophets of the Most High, chiefly through GMS or Great Millstone, as well as the brothers that come in the spirit of GMS, out on the highways and byways preaching this word, as well as putting up video epistles like this, breaking down the scriptures in 144% truth and correctness, letting you Edomites know who you are and showing you that, that your time of rulership, especially you Edomites in the United States of America, is almost up, and these other nations are starting to turn against you. We have heard a rumor from Yahweh, and an ambassador is sent among the heathen. Arise ye, and let us rise up against her in battle. And now I'm going to jump down to verse 7, which is dealing with the allies of you Edomites in the United States of America turning against you. All the men of thy confederacy, or your allies, have brought thee even to the border. The men that were at peace with thee have deceived thee and prevailed against thee. They that eat thy bread have laid a wound under thee. There is none understanding in him. And we can see right now there's a growing consensus of a disgruntlement amongst America's different allies all across the planet, because they see that dealing with the United States does more harm to them than it helps them. If they go to war as an ally of the United States of America, it's usually their countries that feel the blowback. And if they want to get out of line of following after the U.S., what does the U.S. do? Use their world reserve currency, that U.S. dollar, to put sanctions on that country and heavily penalize them. So now what are we seeing? Calls for de-dollarization growing with each passing day, with more and more nations looking towards the east, looking towards the BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and other nations that are joining it to find ways to get around the U.S. dollar SWIFT system. They're also looking and trading in their own national currencies amongst each other. And that U.S. dollar was the main way that the U.S. was able to keep a lot of these nations in check. And then also, you've got a lot of these allies of the U.S. starting to look to other nations for political and military ties and help. And what this is ultimately going to culminate into is at some point during World War III, America's allies, even her own European allies in NATO, turning against her and them shooting 200 million nuclear missiles onto the United States of America, turning it into the biblical lake of fire from sea to shining sea, and then a desolate, uninhabitable wasteland afterwards. And I opened up the video with these verses to preface a few articles I'm going to go into, showing how the men that were at peace with America are deceiving her and starting to prevail against her. And they that eat thy bread are laying a wound under her, receiving all that money and weapons from the U.S., which, as we're going to see, these nations are looking elsewhere, and they're going to turn around and use them very same weapons against the U.S. But the first article I'll be going to is on RT.com, and the title reads, "The U.S. grip on the Middle East slips and peace breaks out. Washington's poor decision-making is starting to catch up with it as nations choose to pursue peace without American interference. As Washington's influence in the Middle East declines, countries throughout the region are taking to compromise, rapprochement, and peace talks, inflicting a blow to the U.S. narrative that seeks to depict its role as a stabilizer and democracy advocate. And all the men of thy confederacy have brought thee to the border. The men that were at peace with thee have deceived thee. Under the leadership of U.S. President Joe Biden, there has been a notable downgrade in the status of the West among various longtime Middle East allies, as the U.S.-led West exerts the majority of its efforts on the war in Ukraine. Its poor decision-making in the Middle East has finally begun to catch up to it. The first major blow to Washington's influence came in the form of a Chinese-mediated agreement to end a decades-long feud between major regional actors Iran and Saudi Arabia, one which led to the severing of ties in 2016. This has a number of implications for U.S. power in the region. The first being that this collapsed a strategy that the U.S. was developing to unite Saudi Arabia with the likes of Egypt, the UAE, Jordan, Bahrain, and Israel. And I believe this was called the Abraham Accords. And the U.S. talked about selling these different Middle Eastern nations U.S.-made weapons to sweeten the deal of joining the Abraham Accords to become allies of the U.S. and Israel. Hey, but as we're seeing, there's beginning to grow a fracture between the U.S. and its Middle Eastern allies. Like I said, they that eat thy bread receive financial and military support from the U.S. have laid a wound under her. They're going to turn around and use those weapons against the U.S. Against Iran and its allies in the region, the alliance was speculated to serve as the Middle East NATO. The second is that the Iran-Saudi rapprochement appears to have caused Riyadh to scrap its plans for normalizing ties with Israel at this time. And those people over in the Holy Land right now, they aren't the true children of the Most High. The true children of the Most High are known as the so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans today. And those people over in the Holy Land are Edomites as well, Amalekite Edomites. And when you read in Jeremiah 49 verse 20, it talks about how the least of the flock, those Amalekite Edomites, the 1948ers, are going to cause some major conflict in the Middle East that's going to further draw these major nations down into it for the bigger battle in the Valley of Jehoshaphat, the War of Armageddon in Joel chapter 3. The second is that the Iran-Saudi rapprochement appears to have caused Riyadh to scrap its plans for normalizing ties with Israel at this time, something that the Biden administration clearly values as a foreign policy achievement. There's also the additional aspect of this being negotiated by Beijing without any regard for how it would reflect on the White House. Despite attempts in Washington to make the deal seem like something it approves of, the repeated remarks by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu about how close normalization with Saudi Arabia is, it was clearly a blow and has major consequences to the U.S. approach to the region. In March, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman said that he didn't care if the U.S. president had misunderstood things about him. And later in April, it was reported he told his advisors that pleasing the Americans is no longer a priority. Hey, those that have been at peace with thee have deceived thee. Immediately after the Saudi-Iran normalization, Riyadh entered into serious negotiations with Yemen's Ansarallah, the Houthis, in order to end the war that has been raging between the two sides since 2015 and has claimed around 400,000 lives in the country. To make things worse for the U.S., Saudi Arabia's foreign minister recently made a trip to Damascus. And remember, Damascus is the capital of Syria, and the U.S., Israel, and the West fomented that Syrian civil war to weaken Bashar al-Assad's regime, to what? Further balkanize the Middle East so that the 1948ers would be the sole strong power in that Middle Eastern region. Read something called the Oded-Yinon Plan. To make things worse for the U.S., Saudi Arabia's foreign minister recently made a trip to Damascus to meet with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. In addition to Riyadh's moves in Tunisia reestablishing ties with Syria, it also appears as if Ankara, which is in Turkey, I believe it's the capital, may be on the cusp of rapprochement with Damascus, and there's a push for Syria to be reintegrated into the Arab League, which clearly runs contrary to the U.S. agenda. And take note about how a lot of these Middle Eastern nations are starting to realign their positions towards one another, and it's putting the U.S. on the negative end of that. Then we have the fact that Qatar has announced it is restoring ties with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, which is not as significant as the above-mentioned moves, yet adds to a list of peacemaking decisions taken without America. On the level of optics, this makes it seem as if the common denominator is the absence of the U.S. Hey, all the men of thy confederacy have brought thee even to the border. On the other, let's go back to Obadiah real quick. I can't finish this video without reading verse 2. Behold, I have made thee small among the heathen. Thou art greatly despised. On the one hand, you Edomites and your nation is the minority race of people on the face of the earth. And on the other hand, your reputation, especially the reputation of the United States of America, is being made small, and you're being despised amongst these different nations all across the planet because they're sick of you going back on your word and constantly meddling in their affairs. To put them in a bad position, just you can put yourself in a better position. On the level of optics, this makes it seem as if the common denominator is the absence of the U.S. On the other hand, Washington's development of ties with the Kingdom of Morocco is egging on tensions with neighboring Algeria. Not only is the Biden administration adding fuel to the fire in the diplomatic feud between both sides, but is helping exacerbate military tensions in the Rabat-Algiers arms race. Earlier this April, the U.S. approved a potential $524.2 million sale of HIMARS artillery rocket systems to Morocco. But now I'm going to go to 2 Esdras chapter 15 real quick. And remember what I said about taking note of all these different Middle Eastern Arab nations realigning their positions towards one another, which puts the U.S. at the outside of it. This is 2 Esdras chapter 15, verse 28. Behold, an horrible vision, and the appearance thereof from the east. Hey, that eastern world, that Middle Eastern region, where the nations of the dragons of Arabia shall come out with many chariots. Saudi Arabia, Syria, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, where the nations of the dragons of Arabia shall come out with many chariots, and the multitude of them shall be carried as the wind upon the earth, that all they which hear them may fear and tremble. These different, Middle Eastern Arab nations, militaries coming out and being gathered up in that Middle Eastern region for the bigger battle in the Valley of Jehoshaphat. Back again in Joel chapter 3, verse 30. Also, the Carmanians, and the Carmanians is an ancient name for the modern day Iranians. And what have we been reading about in that article? China mediating peace talks and rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the dragons of Arabia and the Carmanians. And back when the U.S. assassinated Qasem Soleimani, you had a lot of protests in Iran and Iraq of people from both nations, Arabs, so-called Arabs, or the Ishmaelites, as well as the Iranians, so-called Iranians, or the Elamites, in solidarity with each other, condemning those attacks and that assassination of Qasem Soleimani, because they saw that he was doing a good thing for both of their countries. But of course, it was going against the interests of the U.S. and the state of Israel. Also, the Carmanians, raging in the wrath, shall go forth as the wild boars of the wood, and with great power shall they come and join battle with them. Hey, the Carmanians making alliances with the dragons of Arabia, them coming together and shall waste a portion of the land of the Assyrians. And in the scriptures, the United States of America is known as Babylon the Great, spiritual Sodom and Egypt as pursuant to Revelation 11 verse 8, and also the spiritual Assyrians in some verses. And this is talking about the United States of America right here, and them wasting a portion of the land is what? The Iranians and different of these Arab Middle Eastern nations doing attacks on the U.S., on their forces in the Middle East, and even some parts of the homelands. You do have sleeper cells, mainly in Iran, that are in the U.S., waiting to get the go-ahead to do attacks on so-called soft targets and hard targets as well in the U.S. when a wider war breaks out between those nations. And then what else? As I've been saying throughout the video, there's going to come a point to where America's own allies are going to turn against her, and those with nuclear weapons are going to shoot those nukes onto the U.S., along with America's enemies, such as Russia, China, and Iran, who are going to shoot their missiles onto the U.S. as well. Hey, we're seeing biblical prophecy take place right before our very eyes, and it's only going to increase and intensify since we truly are living in the last seconds of these last days, the last seconds of the rulership of the heathen nations, chiefly of the biblical Edomites, before the ushering in of the kingdom of heaven under the true children of Israel, again known as the so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans today, beginning with the elect of the nation of Israel. Furthermore, the top Middle East partner of the United States, Israel, has been severely weakened by an ongoing domestic political crisis over a proposed judicial overhaul by the Israeli government. Problems have also arisen with Israel's approach to issues like maintaining the status quo at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, a holy site where neighboring Jordan maintains custodianship, and it has caused major rows between Amman and Tel Aviv in recent months. This presents another obstacle to the U.S., which is being forced to mediate between both sides to maintain calm. Another layer is the feud between Biden and Netanyahu, which has called into question the special relationship between Israel and the U.S. for the first time since the 1950s. The U.S. strategy in the Middle East has been to impose its dominance primarily through the military sphere. Its selling points have been security, weapon sales, that bread, threats of military action against foes, and the creation of a Sunni-Shia Cold War that pitted Iran and Saudi Arabia against one another. The strength of Iran's weapons programs, along with its regional alliances, has largely left the U.S. incapable of maintaining a military edge that severely outweighs the power of its opposition. The American outstretch in the region has seen it driven from Afghanistan in an embarrassing fashion and rendered it incapable of protecting its allies from the damage of potential missile strikes from Iran and its allies. Washington actively builds relationships based upon strategies that puts its own partners in the firing line, but where air defense systems it sells to them do not provide enough protection. That's it with this article. Now I'm going to go to my second article, also on RT.com. Key U.S. ally reduces role of dollar in trade. South Korea and Indonesia are planning to switch to national currencies. And South Korea is known as one of the top allies of the United States of America. Ever since the Korean War back in the 1950s, South Korea maintains a heavy U.S. military presence there. Again, the men that were at peace with thee have deceived thee. The central banks of South Korea and Indonesia have signed a memorandum of understanding to promote bilateral trade in national currencies, moving away from the US dollar as an intermediary. The step is expected to help South Korean and Indonesian corporations to lower transaction costs and exposure to exchange rate risks, the central banks of the two nations said in a joint statement. Hey, the men that eat thy bread have laid a wound under thee. Again, because South Korea receives a lot of military financial support from the U.S., but here they are looking to do economic financial deals outside of solely using the U.S. dollar. The Bank of Indonesia and the Bank of Korea highlighted that they could continue to strengthen collaboration through information sharing and regular discussions as the two nations seek to boost financial ties. The agreement was signed on the sidelines of the 26 ASEAN plus 3 finance ministers and central bank governors meetings that kicked off in South Korean city of Incheon on May 2nd. The Asian Plus 3 group consists of 10 member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which are joined by China, Japan, another major ally of the U.S., and South Korea. And just recently, Japan got some exemptions from sanctions against Russia to get Russian oil and natural gas sent to them. Attempts to shift away from the greenback in international trade have been gaining momentum among major economic blocs such as ASEAN and the BRICS group, which consists of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The step comes against the backdrop of sweeping sanctions introduced by Western nations against Russia, a major global energy producer and exporter. The head of the Indonesian central bank, Perry Wario, said last month that his nation was implementing a shift away from the dollar with countries such as Thailand, Malaysia, China, and Japan. In March, Brazil and China signed an agreement to trade in their own currencies, dropping the greenback as an intermediary. And also you've got Mexico looking more and more to go into the camp of Russia and China to do political, financial, and military deals. So, hey, two examples clearly showing that the strength of the United States of America globally continues to decline. Hey, I've made thee small among the heathens. Thou art greatly despised. It's ultimately going to culminate in these nations, even America's own allies, hey, going against her with military force at some point during World War III. But now I'm going to close it out in Habakkuk chapter 2. I'm going to start at verse 4. Behold, his soul, which is lifted up, is not upright in him. Speaking of you, Edomites, as it says in Psalms 58, the wicked are estranged from the womb. You Edomites are wicked and clean contrary to the ways of righteousness and the laws, statutes, and commandments of Yahweh Bahashem Yahweh Shai, straight from the womb. Cheaters, liars, thieves, killers, grapists, every negative attribute is the character of your soul. But the just shall live by his faith. And the nation of Israel, beginning with the elect right now, living by their faith in Yahweh Bahashem Yahweh Shai and proving their faith through their works. Verse 5, yeah, also because he transgresseth by wine. And that isn't talking about a bottle of Merlot. That's talking about spiritual wine, these different philosophies that these Edomites, primarily from the United States of America, push onto these different nations to bug them out. Democracy, feminism, the alphabet group, etc., which when you look at the West And these other nations that follow after those ways, what do you see? Broken families, women that are whores, children that are out of order, and Decepticons running around everywhere. Weak moral character, weak financial systems, the list goes on and on. Yeah, also because he transgresseth by wine, he is a proud man, neither keepeth at home. And how many American military bases are across the planet? It's in the 800s. And not just these Americans, but look at the history of you Edomites, from colonization all the way up until today, going into nations to where you had no business being, setting up puppet governments so you could grape that nation of its resources and put your influence on it to make people second class, third class citizens in their own countries. He is a proud man, neither keepeth at home. What the hell is the U.S. doing in the Middle East? Bringing peace and democracy? No, really. Looking after its own geopolitical and resource interests. Would you have Trump say, hey, we went to Iraq, I would have just taken all the oil. And what did Trump say when he was president and put that U.S. military presence in Syria? We have retrieved the oil. Who enlargeth his desire as hell and is as death and cannot be satisfied. And here you Edomites have the planet under your control right now, and you're still not satisfied. You would think that you got people. You would think that if you have the world reserve currency and people at one point looking at America as the golden beacon of the world, that you just calm your jets and try to keep that system going. But no, the U.S. continues to do what? Fuck over its own allies, put sanctions on its allies as well as its enemies, and just further turn these other nations against her, which is why you're seeing her allies starting to turn against her and these nations looking to do trade outside of the U.S. dollar, weakening the power of it. Who enlargeth his desire as hell and is as death and cannot be satisfied, but gathereth unto him all nations and heapeth unto him all people. And hey, on the one hand, you have the U.S. again using the dollar as its world reserve currency to get these other nations to follow after its dictates. Because what's one of the most common languages out here? English. And you need English to become a pilot and do other certain businesses have other certain types of jobs out there. And again, that dollar with those dead Edomite presidents on it is the world reserve currency. And what's considered a professional look? Wearing a business suit, having a shaved face. Then you got a lot of these people out here dyeing their hair blonde and trying to get their eyes blue. But on a bigger level, you have the elites of these Edomites, such as your Rothschilds and your Rockefellers, pushing for what? That NW0, that GREATRESET, that fourth industrial revolution, to where everybody, all nations, all peoples are under one government, one religion, and one currency, one digital currency predicated upon the Charagma, the MARKOFTHEBEAST in Revelation chapter 13, verses 16 to 18, which is that RFID/NFC C-hip implant. And while a lot of these nations are naturally disgruntled with the U.S., in a lot of cases, the heads of state of these different nations are also on board with the NW0 and following after the dictates of the elites to what? Further weaken the U.S. dollar and the U.S.'s role as a world superpower so they can bring about what? That digital cashless society predicated upon that C-hip and have a multipolar world, but all under the umbrella of that NW0. But when you look at it, these characteristic traits of going into other countries and overthrowing their ways of life and their governments to set up a new way, so to speak, and to follow after that way. And if you go out of it, You're punished for it is solely a trait of the Edomites. And even you can go into the book of First Maccabees, where it talks about how Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes sent out letters to all the nations back then to stop following after the ways of their fathers and follow after the ways of the Grecians, Hellenization, gathering unto him all nations and heaping unto him all people. Just as the Spirit beareth witness that you so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans are the children of Israel, the Spirit beareth witness that the biblical Edomites, the wicked of the Bible, are you so-called white people. Verse 6, shall not all these take up a parable against him and a taunting proverb against him and say, woe to him that increaseth that which is not his. How long? America's allies beginning to turn against her and form alliances outside of the West and U.S. hegemon to make their own path because they're sick of the U.S. using them as a whore, using them up and then casting them to the side once they get what they want. Woe to him that increaseth that which is not his. How long? And to him that ladeth himself with thick clay. And when we go into the Strongs for that word clay, it's H5671, something pledged, i.e. collectively, pawned goods. In the outline of biblical usage, weight of pledges, heavy debts. And the U.S. is known as what? A debtor nation, a nation full of debt that sells its debt, those U.S. Treasury bonds, to countries outside of the U.S. in order for these countries to use the U.S. dollar. And then if you look at damn near everybody in the United States of America itself, the citizens, they're laden with debt, housing debt, student loan debt, car debt, etc., etc. And then to anybody who's watching this video that hasn't read the book, I would highly recommend you read it, called Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which dealt with an Edomite who worked for these major different American corporations, and he would go to these different third world countries that were rich in natural resources and get their leaders to allow U.S. companies to come and set up shop there, and then for these nations to start heavily trading and using the U.S. dollar, which their currency didn't have the same strength as the U.S. dollar. So when these corporations and different U.S. enterprises had built up their infrastructure in that country, and these countries couldn't pay back these American enterprises, they had to start selling off assets of their country to pay it back, because again, their local currencies weren't as strong as the U.S. dollar. So woe to him that increaseth that which is not his. How long? And to him that ladeth himself with thick clay. Verse 7, shall they not rise up suddenly that shall bite thee? Hey, as we just read in those articles, America's own allies start in the Middle East, starting to look at the enemies of the U.S. and enemies that they had as not being as big a threat to them as the U.S. is a bigger threat to them, simply being allies with them. And then America's other allies, like South Korea, for instance, looking to find more ways to trade outside the U.S. dollar. Like I've been saying throughout the video, ultimately America's allies turning against her at some point during World War III and going against her, and those with nuclear weapons using those nukes on the U.S. Shall they not rise up suddenly that shall bite thee, and awake that shall vex thee, and thou shalt be for booties unto them. Point blank, period. So that's it with this video. And with this video, I hope you sincere Akim and Akwath were edified. Hey, just keep strong. As we can clearly see, we are almost out of this final wicked captivity of the heathen nations, chiefly of the Edomites, primarily from the United States of America. And as always, I'm going to say Abad Babol, Kwam Yasharallah, and until next time, Shalom.